Hey guys, welcome back to the second part of my interview with Dr. Mark Caldwell. So we're going to pick up where we left off last time. I was going to break it down into a couple of episodes, but I've decided to keep it as one entire video. So it's just over an hour long, but you're going to enjoy it. So let's get back to where we left off on the previous video. So enjoy, guys. But if you could just give us a brief explanation of your PhD and sort of what findings you got from it, how that's changed your outlook on.
Well, the first thing about the PhD is that, as I said, I set out to try and look for a link between hoof shape and specific pathologies. But in order to be able to do that, during the literature review part of the initial stage of the study, it became apparent to me that whilst there was a lot of scientific investigation into various pathologies, and a lot of scientists had linked poor hoof conformation to catastrophic injuries and lamenesses, there was very little control, if any, on the trimming and shoeing protocols. And in fact, one of the papers that really struck me was a study that was done in 2006 and 2009 on the relationship of the hoof capsule to the skeletal structure. Those people, after studying X many feet and taking both lateral and dorsal palmar radiographs with a series of measurements, came to the inevitable conclusion that trimming the foot alters the skeletal orientation of the pedal bone inside the foot. Well, big frigging deal. Any reasonable horseshoer would have been able to tell you that in the first place. So I thought, what a waste of time that was. But then the same people produced another study where they got 6 individual farriers to trim 6 horses each over a 6 trimming cycle period and took the same measurements. Now the horses were a relatively well controlled group, so they were similar size, similar breed, similar conformations, that were all conformations scored to reduce the variables. And the thing that really came out of that study was, not only was there a significant difference in the post-trimming effects by individual farriers, but worst of all, there was a significant difference in the post-trimming effects of individual farriers during individual trims during the process.
Right, okay.
So that made it pretty clear to me that the trimming protocol was kind of uncontrolled. And what that meant was that if I look back at other literature that had tried to study farriery in relationship to the treatment of pathologies, again, there was no trimming or shoeing protocol defined in the paper, other than to say the feet were trimmed or shod to hoof pastern access or to balance. The 2 papers that I mentioned previously had thrown that right out of the water. So what these scientists were telling us, it was they couldn't determine the results of the shoeing treatments on these pathologies because there was no control over the methodology of the trimming and the shoeing.
Yeah, that makes sense, yeah.
So the first element of my study then was to try and look at a way of controlling or standardizing the trimming protocol so that I could get repeatable measurements that I could study. By having an accurate and repeatable set of measures based on a standardized trimming protocol, I would then be able to gauge scientifically or quantify the effects of any interventions that are made, because I knew that the trimming protocol left me at point zero. And I'm not trying to say for a minute that the trimming protocol gave me a balanced foot or was perfect. What I am trying to say is that I was trying to design a trimming protocol and a mapping protocol that gave me consistent measurements that I could then evaluate. And that's really important in terms of Farrier related discussions. Most of the knowledge that we have in Farrier is empirical by nature. It's been handed down from master to apprentice or father to son. It's anecdotal and unquantified and not peer reviewed. That doesn't mean that those people were wrong. What it means is that somebody can't repeat it as a process in terms of establishing a scientifically validated answer to a scientific question. Yeah, so what I was saying there was that most of the information that's handed down to us is empirical information about hoof balance and stuff. There's no proof to it. And we operate, as Farriers, we operate on those assumptions. But what's worse is that a number of vets end up prescribing us shoes to apply or trimming things to apply based on these assumptions that don't always fit into the live model. You can't always keep cutting the toe down or to restore it to this specific angle. And so the next element of the thesis study was to try and validate as much as possible some of these original assumptions, particularly about what constitutes a balanced hoof. One of the big ones is sort of hoof ratios in terms of where the bone sits inside the foot and is hoof past and heel alignment. And from a veterinary perspective, the validation of that comes from a simple line diagram that was in a paper by Chris Collis in 1983, which was about interpreting radiographs. And I'm just going to quickly sketch that line diagram because you'll all recognise it. And Collis intended that to be a guideline for how he interprets radiographs. But what's happened is that guideline has been transposed into a rigid rule that is now applied by veterinary medicine with no thought or question into its validity to every prescription that you get. And often those prescriptions are impossible to fulfill in the manner in which they're asking you, because the anatomy, the internal anatomy of the foot and its conformation won't allow you to achieve it without making a horse lame. So you need another way of achieving the mechanical interface of this anatomical structure that relieves that pressure. So that's where it went to. So I'm just going to sketch this real quick.
Yeah, okay.
Because you'll recognise it, and it's really important and a fundamental kind of principle to what everybody believes. So if I just pop in the hoof capsule here, just a quick diagrammatic representation, pop in part of the skeletal structure. Here's P3, P2, distal sesamoid, P1, and 3 sesamoid. What Collis said in this diagram was that this angle here was equal to the angle of the phalanges and was equal to the angle of the heel. He then went on to say that a line dropped from the centre of rotation of the joint, bisected the weight bearing surface equally in half. And that constituted the way considered to be a correctly balanced foot. If anybody's got a horse like this, by the way, you can dial 077 9237 4551 and I've got cash waiting. Because I've never seen one in 40 years. Mm-hmm. But this has become a prescription, a rule.
Right, okay.
When it was a guideline.
Yeah.
So one of the other things to add to that was this heel height ratio. And what they said was is the height of the heel was a third of the height of the toe. So that's now the full picture. But we're called to deal with horses that don't match this. Mm-hmm. Now, it made sense to me that mechanically this might be the most efficient model.
Yeah.
But morphologically, we're all different. If I can use a little example, Josh, can we borrow you? You want to come in the picture a minute? Stand there next to Alex. Both these nice young men, young fit, young specimens unlike me, the grey-haired old fat man here. They're both roughly the same height, probably roughly the same weight. And if you both lift up your right arm, they can both do that. You both lift up your left arm, they can both do that. Both nod your head, they can both do that. In exactly what appears to be the same way. But if you take a careful look at them, they look completely different. Yeah, they're not the same specimen. If you hold out your right arm,
yeah,
and you hold out your right arm, they're even different lengths. So they're conformed and put together differently. Mm-hmm. So although they can achieve the task of lifting their arm up and down, they're using a different level of mechanical efficiency to achieve that. So one of them is likely to wear out quicker than the other one. And that's the same with horses. Okay? But basically, anatomically, the skeleton is primarily there to affect movement and protect vital organs. One of the horse's natural instinct is fright and flight. So here it is mowing the lawn, and along comes the mountain lion. Oh shit, I've got to get out of here. 0 to 35, 40 mile an hour in the split of a second. And in order to be able to do that, it needs to be able to release vast amount of kinetic energy quickly. And it needs to be able to turn and move quickly to avoid the predator. So over time, it's evolved into this thing that's got long limbs that allow it rapid movement, and in order to do that it's got this muscular tendinous structure that operates like a series of levers and pulleys that allow it to extend and flex to affect this rapid movement. But it also needs to be stable. So to give the skeleton stability, it's joined together by a series of extremely strong ligaments that give the joint stability during load and in movement, and then the movement is affected by these tendons, extensor and flexor. The hoof capsule, this bit here, is a malleable structure. It needs to be, because A, it has to absorb the shock of high speed movement, and B, it has to be flexible enough to cope with the variances in undulating ground, so that what it doesn't do is increase the shock through these vital mechanical structures and increase the strain. So this hoof capsule, like these tendons and ligaments, have got what they call elastic properties. In other words, it can bend and yield under pressure, and when that pressure is released, returns to its original shape or form. That pressure is created by force, and if you increase the magnitude of the force, in other words, you increase the load, and you increase the time that it's under that increased load, you're increasing the strain. Eventually, these structures reach a point in that stress-strain curve where they go past their limits of elasticity. In other words, they can't stretch anymore. Just past that is their peak strength. As that strain goes past that peak strength point, they distort or deform or fracture into what's called plastic deformation. In other words, the original load deformation now becomes more permanent. So lots of examples of the morphological things that you see in feet, like collapsed under on heels, flat bars, elongated toes, are a direct result of the structure's inability to be able to cope with the amount and time that it's under load. In other words, it's gone past its plastic deformation. Because this is bendable and movable, if that force is applied in a different place, what happens is, if it's applied in a different place relative to its conformation, what happens is that conformation places more stress on one part. So we take a normally conformed one like so, and now we give it a long sloping pastern. The point of force is further back. So now this structure, the heel end, is permanently under pressure. So it deforms permanently. If it's more upright, then the front is under more pressure. So you end up with a shorter, more upright configuration in the dorsal hoof wall.
Yep.
Because the properties of horn are not, the stresses on it aren't equalized out. This magic word, equilibrium. Okay? And that's really the kind of definition of what balance is. Balance is not a form or shape in terms of its strict interpretation. What it is a form and shape that gives you the most efficient method of mechanically distributing that force and effecting movement across it. Yeah? So it's dynamic rather than this static diagram.
Yeah.
And we can affect that force, if you want to hold that,
Yep.
by manipulating the base of this in A, the way that we trim it, but B, when we can't trim it to restore this mechanical efficiency, by changing the base by adding a new base, the shoe.
Yep.
But if, as we tend to practice, we follow the form of this deformed hoof, then the forces are still in the wrong place.
Yeah.
So in order to effect mechanical efficiency when applying a shoe placement, because this is now the new bearing surface, is important to the position of load from this limb. So then the hoof will start to behave as if it was normal. I can't make it normal, it's not going to stay normal shaped, but I can kind of kid it mechanically into thinking it is. One of the analogies that I use sometimes in the lectures and clinics I do is it's a bit like having your tyres changed. when you go to the tyre fitter, there's some moron there with his radio stuck in his ear and his trousers round his backside. He puts on a new tyre on your rim, puts some air in it and sticks it on this thing that spins it round. As it's spinning round, the wheel's wobbling because it's not balanced. The turning forces aren't in equilibrium, and so the wheel's wobbling on the thing. So eventually the little computer says, stick me this little lead weight on there. So our moron in the overalls and the baseball cap reaches in the box, gets out a little lead weight, sticks it on the side of the tyre, gives it a tap with a hammer, all of a sudden it's balanced. Well guys, I've got some bad news for you. Guess what we are? That moron. There's our lead weight on our wheel.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah? Except that, when we interpret the wobble in this, there is no computer, there are no spare parts, you can't change it. What you've got to do is accommodate it and compensate for it by the judicious selection
Of your shoe.
and placement of the device that you're putting on to compensate for it. The shoe.
Yeah.
That's the art, for me, that's the art and skill of farriery. And so that our four-legged friend here can work for the duration of its natural working life as a slave and servant to us mankind, within the limits of its individual conformation. You asked me earlier what the problem is, and I said some of these people are asking their horses to go way beyond their natural athletic capability. That's because they're not selecting these horses based on conformation for the job that they're asking to do. They're selecting them on the basis of how nice they look. Yeah, and so they're not fit for purpose.
But then you're required to fulfill that purpose somehow, and hence why we have to have the additional shoes.
And when it all goes wrong, guess who's the person that gets the blame? Not the guy that designed the car, but the guy that fitted the lead weight to the tyres.
Yes. Okay, so we've just gone over all that, but what I'm sort of thinking now, and I know a lot of the people that are watching this video are probably thinking, how can we use the information or the outcome of your study to actually improve our level of farriery, or how we actually trim feet or prepare feet for shoes and even shoe making. So what just to check my questions. So what did you find in regards to balance, and then this study that you highlighted before, is it correct? Or if not, why not, and how do we actually, how should we be interpreting it?
Right, well, it's complex in its simplicity. Okay. To test the hypothesis, I took a number of previous bits of information, some from Zavoldi, some from Gene Overnick, and in particular from Dave Duckett, a well-known farrier from Pennsylvania. And so what we did from there was develop a mapping protocol, this grid that you will be familiar with now. You'll have seen me and Alex doing it on the internet, that's designed around trying to locate specific internal anatomical positions. And Duckett had argued that a point that he described as his dot, 3/8 of an inch back from the point of frog, was the centre of balance of the foot, or the bone inside the hoof. So I wanted to try and identify whether that was right. And then other people had argued, Collis had argued, that the centre of rotation bisects the ground bearing border, so I wanted to be able to check that. And Overnick had argued that there was a ratio between the length of the frog and the position of breakover, so I wanted to be able to check that, as well as test the hypothesis that it was common for horses to have a similar dorsal hoof wall angle, phalangeal axis and heel angle. So the first part of the study, we designed a standardized trimming protocol and then mapped these feet out, highlighted these certain positions, the point of breakover, Duckett's dot, what we thought would be the centre of rotation of the foot, and what we found was that we could consistently, within a couple of millimetres, accurately pinpoint the vertical orientation of the centre of rotation of the distal interphalangeal joint, and we could reasonably accurately dictate the position of the dorsal tip of P3 within the foot, but the rest of them were very variable in finding that location. And we tested that through a series of dissections and a series of radiographs to check out these markers. Within that, we also found that this triaxial alignment didn't exist at all.
Right, okay.
In any of the specimens that we've done. And over the total of the study, which is up to some 900 feet, we couldn't find one that had a triaxial alignment.
Okay.
And in fact, the average differential in heel angle to toe angle was about 13 degrees different. And the phalangeal axis was largely dictated to by the position of P3, and that related to this heel toe height ratio, which I said before was roughly about 3:1. In our study, the average was about 2.7, 2.8:1, so slightly under. So that was the first thing. So we could accurately pinpoint the anatomical position, but there was no consistent proportionality. You couldn't say that it was 50%, 45%, or whatever. On average, throughout the group, it works out at about sort of 42, 43% of the total bearing border, but they were all different with a broad range. So that confirmed the individual nature of the way that the hoof capsule distorts under load and the way that it metamorphosizes over time, depending on the conformation and the forces applied to it. So the next part of that was to say, well, hang on a minute, everybody's telling us that this wild horse barefoot model is the perfect example of how horses' feet should be managed. So I contacted Chris Pollitt and Brian Hampson, who were at that time were in the throes of doing their Bromby study. And I asked Brian to give me the photographic and radiographic records of his original set of Brombies. And there was about 100 of those. And so he sent me that data, and I then proceeded to use the same mapping protocol on the wild horse sample that Brian had sent me to see if there was a difference between the domestic horses that I was looking at and this so-called wild horse model. Now, funnily enough, I found no significant variation in these proportions between the wild horses and the domestic horses. Now, I'm using the word proportions rather than angular measurements on it, or linear measurements, because that will become clear in a minute. To make this valid, you know, all these horses are different sizes. So rather than have linear straight measures, I took it as a proportional length of something. So the only difference that I noticed between the feral horses and the domestic horses was the difference in what in the thesis I call the cop core distance, the distance between Duckett's dot and the centre of rotation. Now, on average, there was roughly a 3-4% difference in this distance between feral horses and domestic horses. What that distance indicates is the morphology of the solar arch. Okay, the arched bit of the sole underneath the arched part of P3. Now, in the shod domestic model, I can use this as an example. Okay, sorry, I'm making coffee. In the barefoot model, as you apply a load, all of the structures underneath it become weight sharing at some point during the stance phase. In the shod model, and I know this shoe doesn't fit, but if you look at the back of this, I don't know whether or not the camera can see that, but as I push down on it, the back part of the foot has got further to travel.
Yeah.
So there's less likelihood of it weight sharing for the same period of time.
Yeah.
In that process, and there's all sorts of evidence available, this, as it's being loaded, the sole flattens out. So in the domestic horses that had a history of being shod, basically the sole had flattened out and was slightly thinner, and so there was slightly more dorsal migration.
Right, okay.
Which is this difference between this cop core difference.
Yeah, that's where the 3 to 4% was coming
Yeah.
from. Right.
So, and the 3 or 4% difference becomes important when you start going back into other sciences done, because Mohlman and Van Heel, for example, in a study that they did, they showed that the centre of pressure could move 3 or 4% over the period of an 8-week shoeing cycle, but a horse could still cope with it. In other words, as the foot morphologically changed shape, the horse had a mechanism to be able to compensate for that change, excuse me, up to about 3 or 4%.
Right, okay, yeah.
And beyond that, then it had to start changing its gait that you would then determine as a lameness or poor performance or whatever.
Yeah.
And this 3 or 4% consistently raises its head in all sorts of research that's related to foot and load on tendons,
right, okay.
etc. So it becomes an almost constant. So, excuse me. So that was that aspect of it. So, like Hampson, I could find no evidence to suggest that a barefoot model offered any other mechanical advantage to a domestically managed horse, other than the difference in this shoeing thing.
Right.
Okay, where there was a slight difference in the morphology of this solar arch. So the next part of the experiment that I did, I decided that what I would do was monitor a group of horses that were managed barefoot,
Yeah.
and a group of horses that were managed shod, both trimmed using this standardized trimming protocol, and I used a standardized shoeing protocol for the horses that were shod, keeping the groups of horses as narrow as I could in terms of size, build, conformation,
Yeah.
etc., so that the variables
Reducing the
were
variables,
as
yeah.
much as possible
Yeah.
reduced. And I monitored those, taking the same measurements over a number of shoeing cycles. What became evident out of that was that the morphological behaviour between both groups was completely different.
Right.
The barefoot model, over the period of the monitoring, became more upright, and there was palmar migration of the heel buttress,
Right.
and a reduction in linear length of the dorsal toe.
Okay.
In the shod model, at each post trimming and shoeing cycle, the measurements were back to the first set of measurements. In other words, all I could do over the period of time in the shod model, have relatively healthy feet, was maintain them in the roughly same position, give or take this 3 or 4% over the cycle.
Yeah, yeah.
So they moved 3 or 4% and they got dorsal migration of both toe and heel, 3 or 4%. And every time I shot it, I brought it back 3 or 4%, and they were back to the same thing. That showed two things. One, the repeatability of the processes, which is quite important. But two, the mechanical behaviour of the two sets of samples must be different. And the only variant that was different was this, the horseshoe.
Yeah.
So the horseshoe applied to the foot was clearly having a significant effect on the mechanical behaviour of the foot.
Right, okay, yeah.
So that leads you to conclude...
I was just going to say, this is sort of heading in the direction of...
Yeah, what's the way forward?
Yeah, is barefoot best? Which is a huge topic at the moment, and people are very passionate about barefoot, horses being barefoot and against maybe shoes. And I think Mark's going to sort of explain this very well off the back of his study. Yeah, so in your opinion, Mark, the outcome, what do you think is best?
Well, there's a couple of answers to that. To the farriers, I'll say to you, pay a little bit more attention to the trim and listen to Mrs. Smith and charge her a lot more money, same as the barefooters do, and you'll find that that process is more economically viable because you don't have the costs.
Yeah.
But clearly, for the health of the hoof, in its natural kind of environment, barefoot is more controllable for the horse.
Yeah.
You know, growth matching wear over a period of time depending on the terrain that it's interacting with. The problem comes with the fact that the horse is domesticated and we require it to do a job of work. These days that work isn't pulling a cart anymore, it's providing pleasure and leisure and sporting activities. But the limitations of that work, or the horse's ability to perform that work to its maximum, are limited by everything that's above this hoof, i.e. the rest of the horse. And as I've already demonstrated to you, this changes shape depending on what this is doing and where it is. And the more this distorts, the more difficult it is for the horse to maintain a kind of mechanical efficiency in loading and movement, and therefore equilibrium. So we have to get the best out of it, develop a way of enhancing that process so that we get a longer period of work out of it over the duration, depending on its conformation. And that's where this bit came in. So, accepting the fact that the horse is domesticated and we want it to do something, this, applying a steel or iron shoe to the bottom of a horse's foot, has stood the test of time for 2,000 years. It's cheap, it's economical, it's viable, and providing it's done in a timely way and managed quite well, it's effective. And it can enhance the performance of a given animal depending on its relationship with its own conformation. That's been proven over thousands of years. Importantly, however, This is a highly skilled job. To get the maximum amount of this, you need not only a high degree of skill in terms of being able to make, fit and apply without doing damage, and being able to improve the overall performance of it or the efficiency of it, back to the example of the man with the lead weight. But you also need to be able to understand the causative effects of this on this in order to be able to design and implement a trimming or stroke shoeing plan that's going to maximise your benefit of having to apply this. And that's where the change in modern day farriery focused more on a more in-depth knowledge and understanding of not just anatomy but functional anatomy and the biomechanical interrelationship of limb with foot and limb and foot with surface that it's working on becomes important in the selection process of what type of shoe you're going to apply for what set of circumstances. As a profession, we've allowed, unfortunately, part of the profession to be hijacked, and that's the deciding what goes on bit, because it's now become prescriptive. Veterinary says to you, I want an egg bar on this, and that's what you go and do. As a farrier, generally speaking, it doesn't matter to you whether it works or not, as long as you've done your job as best as you can. That's what the veterinary said he wanted on it. It may work in some instances, and on some feet it's very effective. But on others it's about as much use as a chocolate teacup. But that's where the selection process comes in. One of my big bugbears about this prescription thing is that you end up in a situation where XYZ shoe is supposed to cure coughs, colds, fluid on the knee, nosebleeds and headaches. But in reality, what these shoes are basically either a front shoe or a back shoe, with a number of additional variants applied to them. The trick to selection is being able to apply those variants to the basic front or hind shoe so that they match specific individual clinical symptoms. The next part of the equation is when you apply something to the bottom of this horse's foot, like this shoe, whilst there are desirable consequences, we prevent it from wearing, we've given it additional grip, there are unintended consequences, i.e. the back of the foot prolapses through the bottom of the shoe. So the next part of the selection process is how do we mitigate or remove as much as possible those unintended consequences
of putting a shoe on.
A good example of unintended consequences is this hoof balance model. Veterinary, I want you to trim this to that, take some more toe off it, rasp that toe back. Okay, I can make it look exactly like Collis's diagram. Unfortunately, I've rasped all the dorsal wall off, taken away the mechanical integral strength of it, and as the horse stands on it, what's left of this inner layer of horn is weak and not able to withstand the pressure, and it collapses. So as a farrier, I need to be able to find an alternative way of achieving the desirable mechanical outcomes, but whilst maintaining the mechanical advantages that the structure and function of the hoof gives you. Hence the importance of understanding your trimming methodology and your trimming protocol in relationship to your shoe selection and the way that you're going to apply it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, does that make sense to you?
That's the sort of the importance of the
Yeah.
skill behind what it is that we actually do. Yeah. And another important outcome of your study was then having that knowledge to read the foot, understand hoof morphology, and then having an idea of how hoof morphology can potentially lead to certain pathologies related to those signs that you actually see in those changes that are being made. And I think that's very important. I think it's without the use of taking any sort of x-rays, the foot tells you as much as you can, as you need to know. So hoof distortion, it's how we actually read that. And I think the outcome of your study, being able to read that hoof morphology, that hoof distortion, to then understand what's actually happening internally, to then come up with a sort of what potential pathologies to develop.
I'm going to go back to this skeletal model then just for a second. The basic model relies on a specific configuration that minimises the stress and the strains on the skeletal and the musculo and ligamentous apparatus that's holding it together and allows it to move. The hoof is constantly changing shape, which means basically that the relationship between the ground that it's contacting and this musculoskeletal unit is changing. So as that conformation changes, as the hoof shape changes, it puts increased strain on some of these tendons and ligaments. Yeah, and increased pressure, we haven't got the navicular bone in here, but increased pressure on some of the joint spaces and the ligamentous apparatus that's holding that thing together and allowing it to be part of the mechanism. So hoof morphology, or the changes in shape, can have a direct relationship to this strain, repetitive strain, on these structures, which is where these pathologies come about. That's what they are. So it struck me that there was, and this goes back to the original pre-navicular study, that there was a link between hoof shape or form and some specific pathologies.
That's
so we'll take some common foot pathologies because we have to limit the study, but what we did then was we took a pile of horses that were admitted to the veterinary hospital at Liverpool, Leahurst, for lameness examinations and MRI studies. Those examinations include an effective diagnosis of the lameness, diagnostic imagery including radiographs, etc., confirmed by MRI. I then took the same set of proportional measurements from the feet of these horses. I didn't intervene with them, I didn't shoot them,
you're just taking them.
just taking measurements. And recorded those measurements, and then at the end of collecting all that data, we characterised the lamenesses 1, 2, 3, 4, blind off the MRI study, and then linked the measurement data to the lameness data. Okay, and what that showed us with some clever statistical analysis rather, is that there was an increased likelihood of specific foot shapes relating to the incidence of specific pathologies. So, for example, where the core measurement was less than 45% of the total length of the foot, there was an increased likelihood or increased odds of nearly 10 to 1 of it having a navicular diagnosis through MRI.
Okay,
Okay, where the core measurement was over 50%, there was an increased odds ratio, again of about 10 to 1, of it being diagnosed with some kind of coffin joint lameness, DJD.
Okay, yeah.
So as this foot changes shape, it's directly showing you where it's likely to put the increased repetitive strain on the internal structure.
Right, yeah.
So basically, guys, you can pick the foot up and you can read it like the book.
Yeah.
You don't actually need the majority of diagnostic imagery you can get, because you can work out where everything is and actually what's happening from the measurements.
Yeah.
Or from the grid.
From your foot mapping.
Yeah,
in essence.
well, yeah, from this foot mapping, but then relating that to some other guidelines that I'll give you. But note I use the word guidelines.
Yes. Yeah,
okay, this accurately finds the centre of rotation and the tip of P3. Everything else I'm going to tell you now is guidelines that will effectively allow you to put this approximately in the right place.
Yeah.
To maximise efficiency. Most scientists would agree that this model would be the most biomechanically efficient.
Yeah.
So although none of the horses have got it, we want to try and make them behave mechanically as if they were.
Yeah, right, okay.
So that's the principle that we use with the toys and the guides that we used yesterday on that horse.
Yeah, right, okay.
It's not that they're accurate and it should be this, that and the other, but it's a guide to trimming methodology and shoe placement.
Right,
to get this to behave mechanically like it was made like that.
It should, right, okay.
The lead weight.
Okay, so just show us some of the tools that we could have as farriers out in our vehicles that we can take to clients just to help us sort of using these tools achieve, or as close as we possibly can, to this sort of theory. How can we use contour gauges, these calipers to sort of help with our trimming protocol?
Okay. The first thing you need to take with you is your brain switched on. And your eyes open.
I think one of the important things of the conversation we've had today is highlighting that there's a lot of thought, a lot of understanding, a lot of using your brain before you actually pick up a rasp or pick up your nippers. Actually look at the foot, understand what the foot is actually telling us. That's what sort of the impression I'm getting from this conversation today.
One of the things that I try to tell students, Josh and Phoebe, my other apprentices, before you actually attack this thing with your knife and your rasp, you need to have assessed it, looked at it and worked out what you want it to look like at the end.
The end of the job,
I call it a cup of tea syndrome. Most farriers, they drive into the yard, open the back of the truck, get the gear out, get the horse out, take its shoes off, trim its feet down and go, right, okay, what we're going to do? It's too late, it's on the floor. You've done it.
You've taken it off,
You can't put it back on, so now you're going to have to live with them consequences. So you rumble around the back of the van, find a set of shoes that are roughly going to fit, bash away until you can get them to fit to what you've done. You finish the job, Sophie goes off and makes a cup of tea, and you sit there on the toolbox drinking a cup of tea, looking at Sophie's legs, chatting about her skiing holiday, hoping that she fancies you. But all the time as a horse shoer, that horse is still stood there and you're looking at it. You can't help yourself. And you start going, oh well, it's a bit this and it's a bit that. Well, I'll get that next time. And you start to see the things that you would have changed. One of the things that we like to do is get the toolbox out, unload the van, get the horse out, Sophie go make a cup of tea. And we'll sit and chat to Sophie about whatever. It's no good me trying to chat her up because looking like this is just not going to work, I'm not going to pull, so we'll talk about anything else. But you're still looking at the horse. And in looking at it, what you're doing is you're assessing it. You're seeing what it is that you want to change the next time you touch it, which is actually going to be in about that long.
Once you've finished your brew.
So you've worked out what you want it to look like. One of the things I did with you yesterday was put those dots all over the horse. was.
Yeah.
So that's a kind of way of looking at it and working out, hang on a minute, this is over there, that's over
What do
there.
you want to achieve? Yeah.
Yeah. So know what you want to achieve.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. And then there's things that you can do that will help you enhance the interpretation of this. You'll find when you've done a few of these foot mapping things, you actually don't need to do it all the time. You can see it. But like the line diagrams that you see in Adams's lameness.
Yeah.
So, but when you're not sure, little things like, if I take if you can just hold that while I'm not very good at this.
This was on the video of the job that we did yesterday. We kind of like highlighted some of these things, but Mark's just going to go over.
If you
them
take
now.
the length of the dorsal hoof wall, basically what that should do is match the distance from the dorsal distal tip of the wall, which is there, look, to the point that you mapped in as the centre of rotation.
Yeah.
Okay, which it does.
Yeah.
If you take Duckett's dot, which is roughly 3/8 of an inch back from the point of frog, what that should do is be the same distance back to the widest point of the frog.
Yeah.
Which it roughly is.
Yeah.
Okay, so those are guides that you can use in terms of the proportions. We've said before that the heel toe height ratio of roughly 3 to 1. I did say it's not quite, but
Slightly under. Yeah.
we can use that as a decent guideline. If we measure that distance up to the hairline at the heel bulb, if I then take that 1, 2, let's try again. I mean, we've got a roll toe on here, so it's going to be a bit short. 1, 2, 3. It would be if I come to there.
Yeah.
Where your roll toe is. Yeah. 1, 2, 3.
You bang on. Yeah.
So those are some easy checks that you can do to make sure that you've got the proportions right.
Yep.
In terms of dorsopalmar and toe length and heel height.
Yeah.
Etc.
In order to get as close to this model as we possibly
close to that mechanical model as possible.
Hence why all these things here, whether it be this, that, the foot mapping, actual doing it, there are all these guidelines to get to that stage, or as close as you possibly can to that.
And there's a simple pair of calipers. We can use, then you get these obscurities and deviations from side to side and misshapes and whatever, and there's a very good example on the video from yesterday.
Yeah.
But basically we take a contour gauge, stick that around the coronary band, push that into the shape around just below the coronary band. That will mirror the shape of, I'll turn it around the other way so you can see, but that will mirror the radius of the toe around the white line. And the reason that the white line is important as a reference, we know that that anatomically originates from the terminal papillae around the distal fringe of P3.
Yeah.
So that's its shape.
Yeah.
That's the shape of P3.
And that inner border of that will always be a representation of P3.
And that's kind of indicative of the load that's being applied to it, because even bone responds to load.
Yeah.
So that's not to say that it's symmetrical, because they're not, but to optimize the sufficient model, you want to try and have as symmetrical platform as you possibly can, concentrically around the centre.
Yeah.
So this gives you an idea of the shape that it should be.
Yeah.
So that when you dress this dorsal hoof ball forward and put that into the shape, you're matching it to the anatomy of the horse.
Yeah.
Then you apply your shoe to the physics of load.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah? Not
Yeah.
recreating or enhancing shear force and distortion, but maintaining strength, but compensating for differential conformational loads.
Yes. Yeah.
That makes sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, guys. So I hope you found our conversation with Mark today quite interesting. Mark's dedicated his entire life to studying this profession and coming up with this study that he's come out with. I think so. If we can take anything away from his findings, the discussion we've had today, I think there'll be a step forward for the trade that we're all passionate about. So I just have to say thank you for that, Mark.
You're welcome.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here, go over all what we've done today. When's the book out?
Well, funny enough, I'm actually working on it, but so hopefully that project will be finished by the end of the year.
Right.
I'm kind of doing that in collaboration with somebody else, but I'm hoping to be able to put all these thoughts down, not so much into a textbook, but more as a sort of self-help.
Yeah. And will that be targeted at? Is that just a general book? Will that be for everybody, or is it for apprentices starting out?
No. It's not for apprentices. I believe that with the apprenticeship thing, I think it is really important that whilst you're giving them background knowledge and understanding of anatomy and physiology and stuff like that what you concentrate on is their mastery of the basic concepts and basic principles.
Right. Okay.
And a broad understanding of how those things can develop into additional methodologies as they progress with their own experience, because the one thing that you can't teach is experience.
Yeah.
And just to kind of conclude on that, and it's a really important kind of thing, is the definition of experience.
Yeah.
And the definition of experience is the culmination of a lifetime's fuck-ups.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
And sorry about the language, but
sort of the success of how you can be as a farrier is the mistakes that you've made along the way.
And students, and particularly apprentices and stuff, they're not going to be able to. They're not in a position to make them decisions for themselves until they're faced with that scenario on their own.
Yeah.
Because as an apprentice, there's always somebody to turn to. What shall I do with this, boss?
Yeah.
Do you want this done, boss? Do you want that done, boss?
Yeah. There's always someone else that can guide them. And I suppose it's one of the important things of continuing our education past those basic. I say basic, they're not basic, but past those first qualifications, and it's the importance of higher education, whether it be any sort of path.
Higher education and further career and skill development are essential for not only your development as a practitioner, but for your own mental well-being. Really, you've got to find your stimulation. I mean, use your horses in Newmarket. It's a factory.
Yeah.
You're underneath those racehorses. You're having to get them done in a period of time, and you very rarely see much variation.
Yes.
So in order to maintain that kind of motivation, you've got to develop an interest in something that allows you to progress mentally, physically, skill-wise, that gives you the stimulation to keep pushing on.
Keep pushing, yeah. And hence why you've got to this stage of your life. So I suppose the final question I'd like to ask you is, what's next for a doctor?
Oh, well, I've been trying to kid all the local ladies that my doctorate is in gynecology, but none of them will let me look. So I guess I might try and catch up with Paul Conroy and get down to this anatomy on a cellular level, or an microenzyme level, Paul. But unfortunately, I haven't been able to find a shoe for a micro. So what's next for me really is the book. Really, I want to further develop this educational side, because I enjoy that. I enjoy going off and doing the clinics and the teaching thing and trying to pass on some of this experience and knowledge. And the one thing that I want to be able to achieve with Farrier, and that comes back to this sort of Facebook post that I put on and stuff, it's not about, look, how clever am I, because I'm not very clever. It's about being able to take the information that's provided by a pile of very clever people, some of these scientists and people like Pollitt and Those, you know, there's a really intellectual. But we take that stuff from them and Jeff Thomason's and be able to translate that into understandable horse shooting speak.
Yes.
So that we can improve our skills, our lot, and benefit ourselves as people. And as a side track, and notice that I say as a side track, benefit the horse.
Yeah, absolutely.
But for me personally, I don't necessarily do it for the horse. I do it for my own satisfaction. But that's where I'm at next. I'd like to do more of his clinics. I'd like to travel a bit more. I've been very lucky in my life. I've travelled to all sorts of places, but I really quite enjoy it. And enjoy the experience of being able to see different places, but in a more localised environment, you know, with farriers and stuff. I don't particularly want to go around and look at churches in Melbourne or churches in Philadelphia or churches in Cambridge. But I like to see life on a local level. I enjoy being able to help people with their knowledge and understanding. If I can provide that, that gives me a buzz. So that's where I'm at.
Great. Well, hopefully we can
win the lottery. That would be really good.
Well, hopefully we can get you down to our forge. I think it'd be great if you can come down and we can maybe put a clinic on. And if anyone would like to come to that, if and when we can make this happen, we'll certainly let you guys know. But thanks again, Mark. Thank you very much. And
more than welcome, mate. Really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
We'll do it again. Cheers, guys. Thank you very much. Okay, guys, so that's a wrap. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this interview with Mark. We've got a couple of videos planned for the future. Mark's going to come down to the forge. We're going to be putting on some more in-depth videos covering the shoeing side and the understanding of what we actually do as farriers in a little bit more detail. We've got a couple of webinars coming up in the very near future as well, so there's plenty of content coming up, fascinating stuff. If you're interested and you want to know a little bit more, you can get in touch with me. I'll drop my email address into the description below, so if you want to know any more, do get in touch with me. But yeah, Mark's traveling over to America in the very near future. He's doing a few tours with alongside the shoeing lab and Workman Horseshoes. So if you want to know any more about that, I'll drop a couple of links again into the description below. Check them out. I'd highly recommend attending any of his dates that he's putting on, any of his clinics. He's a great clinician. Yeah, it's fascinating. So hope you enjoyed it, guys. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I'll see you on the next video. Take it easy.